Folk Tales Sketchbook.
Grandpa Nasuba stares into the fire and says, "The most dangerous man in any village is not the one who knows nothing. It is the one who knows just enough to stop listening." This is the story of Chua, a warrior so brilliant and so blind that it took a grizzly bear, a trickster fox, and several feet of very patient mud to teach him the one thing his maps and equations never could. Tonight we find out what happens when a man so full of his own answers walks straight into a world that was never asking his opinion. Grandpa Nasuba leans forward, firelight catching the deep lines of his face, and he says this: "There is a certain kind of fool who is more dangerous than the ignorant man, and that is the educated man who has decided he is finished learning." His name was Chua, and he was the most dangerous kind of fool the village had ever produced, because he was also brilliant. Chua stood exactly 6 feet tall, moved like a shadow between trees, and could recite the migration patterns of every animal in the territory from memory. Yet he had never once in his life sat in silence long enough to hear what the forest itself was saying. He was 23 years old, which in his own private estimation was more than old enough to have surpassed every elder who had ever breathed mountain air. Every morning, before the other hunters had finished their prayers, Chua had already drawn his maps, calculated wind trajectories, and written out his hunting equations in the dirt with a sharpened stick. He called it optimization. The elders called it something else, but they were polite men who chose their words carefully. Old Hiwi, who had hunted these lands for 50 years and whose hands bore the scars of 100 successful seasons, once knelt at dawn beside a stream and closed his eyes and asked the water spirits for guidance. And Chua stood behind him and actually laughed. Not a quiet, private laugh, but a full, open-mouthed, shoulder-shaking laugh, the kind that travels. He said, and these were his exact words, spoken loudly enough for the entire hunting party to hear: "Old father, the deer does not care about your prayers. The deer cares about wind direction and caloric need and territorial patterns. This is mathematics, not magic." Hiwi opened one eye, looked at Chua with the expression of a man watching a child try to explain the ocean, and returned to his prayer without a single word of response. Chua took that silence as agreement. He was wrong about that, as he was wrong about many things, but the particular tragedy of Chua was that his wrongness was so polished and so confident that it looked, from a distance, almost exactly like intelligence. He had memorized 17 different hunting strategies from the oral traditions of 4 different peoples, analyzed them for inefficiency, discarded what he considered the superstitious elements, and synthesized what remained into what he personally called the Chua method, which he had written down in careful detail, and which he fully intended, someday, to teach to future generations who would thank him for his foresight. Grandpa Nasuba pauses here, looks directly at you through the fire, and says, "You know somebody like this. Maybe you see somebody like this every time you open your phone. The man in the comments who has watched 3 videos about surgery and wants to argue with the doctor. He is Chua. Chua is eternal." The news arrived at midday, carried by a breathless young runner from the eastern ridge, and it spread through the village the way serious news always spreads, quietly but with tremendous speed, person to person, face growing more solemn with each telling. A grizzly had been sighted near the Valley Pass, and not merely any grizzly. The hunters who had seen it from the tree line described an animal of almost impossible size, a bear so large that its shoulders stood as high as a grown man's chest, its paws wider than two hands placed side by side, its coat a deep brown that had gone silver at the edges from age and weather and long survival. It had crossed 3 territories already without being stopped by anything, which told the experienced hunters everything they needed to know about what kind of animal this was. The wise chief called the young warriors together beneath the great cedar at the center of the village, and he spoke with the measured calm of a man who had survived enough close encounters with real danger to feel no need to dramatize it. He said the bear was not to be pursued yet. He said the bear must first be watched, its patterns studied through patient observation, its preferred trails marked, its temperament understood. Because a bear of that age and size had survived precisely because it was not predictable, and any hunter who approached it with assumptions instead of knowledge would find those assumptions returned to him in a very permanent way. The old hunters nodded. They had heard this principle before, not as instruction, but as truth repeated until it became instinct. Chua, standing at the back of the group, with his arms crossed and his weight shifted to one hip, in the posture of a man who is waiting for the speaker to finish so that the real conversation can begin, listened to about half of this before he stepped forward. He did not wait to be invited. He said, loudly and with a smile that he genuinely believed was charming, "Chief, with respect, that approach will take days. I have already analyzed the topographic patterns of this valley, the seasonal feeding behavior of adult male grizzlies, the prevailing wind patterns for this week based on cloud formation, and I have a complete strategic plan that will allow me to locate, approach, and subdue this bear before tomorrow night." The clearing was very quiet. Several of the old hunters looked at the ground. The wise chief looked at Chua for a long moment, with eyes that held no anger, only something sadder than anger. And then he said simply, "You may go, Chua." And Chua heard those words as permission. The chief meant them as something else entirely. But wisdom, it turns out, cannot be forced into a person who has decided his cup is already full. Chua raised one fist in the air in a gesture of private triumph, turned on his heel, and began assembling his gear, already narrating in his own mind the story he would tell upon his victorious return. Chua entered the deep forest at first light the following morning, his hand-drawn map folded precisely and tucked against his chest, his theory intact, his confidence so complete it operated like a wall between him and the actual world. The forest, for its part, was not indifferent to his arrival. Forests never are. The deep wood has its own language, built over 10,000 years of cause and consequence, and it speaks constantly to anyone who has learned to be quiet enough to listen. Chua had not learned this, and so the forest did what it always does with those who refuse to listen. It repeated itself more loudly, and then more loudly still, until there was nothing left but consequences. The first warning came from a blue jay perched on a low branch directly in Chua's path, no more than 20 feet ahead, and that bird opened its beak and produced the sharpest, most insistent alarm call in its considerable repertoire, a sound so urgent and so directionally specific that even a mildly attentive person would have paused. Chua noted it, categorized it as ambient bird noise, and walked directly beneath the branch without slowing his pace. The jay watched him pass with the exasperated expression that blue jays seem to have permanently reserved for this situation. 50 yards further, Chua nearly stepped onto a broad column of ants that had, that morning, reversed their established trail entirely, abandoning a path they had traveled for weeks to move in the opposite direction, a behavior that experienced woodsmen understood as one of nature's most reliable indicators of nearby danger. Chua stepped over them carefully, made a small note in his mental catalog about ant behavior being statistically variable, and continued forward. The third warning was quieter, and therefore more serious. A single green twig on a young birch, positioned at exactly shoulder height to an adult bear, had been bent and snapped in a way that left no ambiguity about the direction of travel or the size of the creature that had passed. An elder would have stopped, crouched, studied the moisture in the break to calculate time elapsed, and adjusted accordingly. Chua glanced at it, decided it was consistent with his map's predicted bear corridor, nodded once to himself in satisfaction, wrote nothing down, and pressed on. He was navigating entirely by theory now, so deep inside his own mental model of how this hunt should unfold that the actual forest around him had become something closer to wallpaper. He was not walking through a living ecosystem. He was walking through a diagram he had drawn himself. And the diagram, unlike the forest, told him only what he had already decided to believe. The fox appeared at the edge of a small clearing where the trail widened and the afternoon light fell in long golden bars between the trees, which is exactly the kind of beautiful, peaceful setting that should make an experienced woodsman deeply suspicious, because the forest does not arrange its lighting for aesthetic reasons. The fox was red and sleek, and sat in the center of the path with the practiced ease of an animal that has had this particular conversation before. Tail curled neatly around its paws, amber eyes regarding Chua with an expression of frank and delighted recognition. Chua stopped. The fox tipped its narrow head to one side. Then it said, in the way that creatures in the old stories speak when they have something to say that a person badly needs to hear, even if hearing it will do them no good whatsoever. "Well, you must be the famous Chua." Chua, who had been expecting a bear, recovered from his surprise quickly, because quick recovery was one of the things he genuinely was good at. He said, "I am." The fox said, "I thought so. I have been in these woods a long time, and I have watched many hunters come through, and I can tell immediately, just by the way a man carries himself, whether he understands the modern science of tracking or whether he is still stumbling around with old superstitions. You, friend, clearly belong to the first category. That map you carry, the systematic approach, remarkable, truly." Chua straightened slightly. This was, he felt, no more than accurate. He said, "You've seen the bear?" The fox said, "Oh yes, I know exactly where that bear is. I've been watching it for 3 days. And I will tell you something honestly, because I respect intelligence when I encounter it. The old chief has it completely wrong. The bear is not in the eastern valley at all. It is in the mossy clearing to the northwest, near the stone ridge. A man with your analytical capabilities could approach from the downwind side and have a clear advantage by early afternoon." Chua looked at his map. The mossy clearing to the northwest was not on it, because it was in a section he had judged too far from the probable trail to be relevant. He hesitated for exactly 1.5 seconds, which was the duration of the only moment of genuine doubt he experienced that entire day. And then the fox added, "Of course, a man of lesser intelligence might dismiss this, but you clearly see the strategic logic." The half second of doubt closed like a door. Chua folded his map along its original crease, thanked the fox with a nod that conveyed more courtesy than he typically extended to anyone, and turned northwest. The fox watched him go, and its expression, as it turned back to the afternoon sunlight, was one that Grandpa Nasuba, when he tells this part, always pauses to describe. Not cruel, not triumphant, simply the old, tired look of someone who has seen this exact thing happen more times than they can count. The mossy clearing appeared exactly as the fox had described it, which was the first thing that should have alarmed Chua and did not. The stone ridge rose on the northern side, pale gray against the afternoon sky, and the clearing itself was wide and open and carpeted in a dense, bright green moss that spread from the tree line to the center of the open ground in an unbroken expanse that caught the light in a way that was, objectively, quite beautiful. Chua stood at the edge and noted several features that aligned with his theoretical framework for bear habitat. Open sightlines, proximity to water sound from a creek somewhere beyond the ridge, evidence of old root disturbance along the margin. His theory, he concluded, was being confirmed in real time by observable data. He felt the particular pleasure of a man whose predictions are proving accurate, which is one of the most intoxicating feelings available to the human mind, and also, in the wrong circumstances, one of the most dangerous. He was already composing the story in his head as he stepped into the clearing. The first step felt firm. The second step felt slightly less firm. The third step, taken confidently and at full stride because Chua had never in his life walked hesitantly toward anything he had already decided was safe, went directly through the thin green surface of the moss, which was not moss over solid ground, but moss over several feet of deep, black, extraordinarily adhesive mud that had been sitting in this low-lying depression for approximately as long as the stone ridge had been standing, accumulating water from the creek and organic matter from the forest floor until it had achieved a consistency that the old hunters, who avoided this particular spot carefully and had a name for it in their language, described as the kind of mud that does not let go of what it catches. Chua went in up to his knee on the first plunge. He lurched forward, trying to recover his balance, which drove his other leg in up to the thigh. He threw his weight backward, which achieved nothing except moving more of his body mass over the mud's surface, and then physics, which does not negotiate, took over entirely. He tried the systematic extraction technique he had once read about for bog survival, pushing down with one leg to create leverage while pulling the other, which the mud received with complete indifference and responded to by pulling him down another 4 inches. He tried rotating his torso to redistribute weight, which the mud also found uninteresting. He tried 3 more approaches in methodical sequence, each derived from a different theoretical framework, and the mud engaged with none of them. Within 20 minutes, the mud was at his waist. Within 40 minutes, it was at his chest. An hour after stepping confidently into the clearing with a bear hunt to complete and a story of triumph to tell, Chua stood with his chin 2 inches above the surface, his arms extended flat across the moss, his map dissolved somewhere below him, his equations irrelevant, his theories all present and correct and completely useless in every practical sense, and the forest around him entirely silent. The light was turning amber and long when the bear arrived, stepping from between 2 large firs at the far edge of the clearing with the unhurried, inevitable quality of something that has never in its long life had reason to move quickly, because nothing in this forest had ever given it genuine cause for urgency. It was, as the hunters had described, an animal of extraordinary size, its silver-edged coat catching the late light, its great head moving slowly from side to side in the broad reading sweep that grizzlies use when they are cataloging their environment. It crossed the edge of the clearing in 4 strides and stopped. It had seen Chua. Chua, who had been clinging to a slender hope that the bear might pass by on the far side of the clearing and not notice the human head projecting from the mud at the center, understood immediately that this hope had expired. He was unable to move. He was unable to run. He was unable to reach any of his equipment. He was unable to apply any of his 17 hunting strategies, not one of which had included the tactical scenario of being chest deep in mud when the target arrived. The bear looked at him. Chua looked at the bear. This exchange lasted a considerable time, long enough for Chua to experience, in sequence, terror, more terror, a strange secondary terror that arrived just when he thought the first terror had peaked, and then, as the bear continued simply looking without moving, a bewildered suspension of all coherent thought. The bear took 3 steps closer. Chua's entire body, from the chin up, attempted to become invisible, which is not a thing bodies are capable of doing. The bear lowered its enormous head until its nose was perhaps 4 feet from Chua's face, and it drew in a long, slow breath through its nostrils, reading everything about the creature in front of it: the fear, the mud, the equipment dissolved somewhere below, the total and comprehensive helplessness of the situation. Then it exhaled. Not a roar, not a threatening sound of any kind, just a long, slow exhale through its nose, the sound an elder makes when a young person has said something so far from wise that argument would be a waste of both their times. And then the bear turned around. It walked back across the clearing at the same unhurried pace at which it had arrived, re-entered the tree line between the same 2 firs, and disappeared into the forest without a backward glance, as though Chua were a thing so beneath consideration that even predation would be an overreaction. The clearing was silent again. A single bird called somewhere far away. Chua's chin remained 2 inches above the mud, and for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing to say. The cold came with the dark, as it always does in the high forest, not gradually but decisively, dropping the temperature in a way that makes the distinction between afternoon and night feel like a door closing. Chua had been in the mud for several hours by then, long enough for the cold to have moved through his clothing and reached his skin, long enough for the bravado to have finished draining out of him completely and been replaced by something that felt very much like the beginning of genuine fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear the bear had inspired, but the slower, deeper fear of a man who has begun to understand his actual situation. He had called out twice in the early evening, loudly, in the direction he believed the village lay, and the forest had absorbed both calls without producing any response. Because the forest is very large, and a human voice, even a confident one, only carries so far. He had then been quiet for a long time, which was, without question, the wisest thing he had done all day. He was in the middle of thinking about his mother, which is what people often think about when they have arrived at the honest bottom of a difficult situation, when he saw the torchlight moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. There were 4 torches, and they arrived without rushing. Old Hiwi came first, the hunter Chua had laughed at for praying to the water spirits, reading the ground ahead of him with a torch held low, following a trail of broken twigs and compressed undergrowth and 100 other small signs that told the story of Chua's passage as clearly as a written record. Behind him came the wise chief, and behind the chief came 2 other hunters, each of them old enough to have grandchildren and experienced enough to move through dark forest without making a sound. They had not tracked Chua by his maps or his equations. They had tracked him by the language of the forest, the bent branches he had dismissed as irrelevant, the disturbed ground he had walked across without reading, the small corruptions in the natural order that every passage leaves, and that trained eyes, attached to patient minds, know how to follow without error. They reached the edge of the mossy clearing and stopped. Hiwi held his torch out over the mud and found Chua's face in its light, and his expression when he found it was not anger, not satisfaction, not the face of a man whose moment of vindication has arrived. It was the face of someone who had been worried and was relieved to find what he was looking for still intact. They worked quietly and efficiently, producing from their packs the broad, flat boards and lengths of rope that experienced woodsmen in this territory always carried precisely because they knew where the mud pits were, and they distributed Chua's weight across the boards and drew him out steadily and without drama. No one said anything unkind. No one said anything at all. Chua stood on solid ground, coated from the chin down in black mud, and he looked at the old hunters around him, and he found that he had no words, which was, for Chua, a genuinely unprecedented condition. The village fire was burning low by the time they returned, and the community had gathered in the way that communities gather when something important has happened. Not loudly, but present, attentive, the way people arrange themselves when they understand that what is about to be said is worth hearing carefully. Chua sat near the fire, wrapped in a blanket someone had placed around his shoulders without being asked, still carrying most of the mud, which had dried to a gray crust on his arms and chest and face. The wise chief sat across from him and was quiet for a long moment, in the way that the very old are quiet when they have something worth saying, letting the silence do the preparation that words alone cannot do. Then he said, "Information is filled with many words, but wisdom is found in the silence of listening. A man who hears only his own voice will always find himself stuck in the mud." He paused. He said, "The forest spoke to you 3 times before the mud. The jay, the ants, the broken twig. They all knew what was ahead. They told you what was ahead. The question was never whether the forest was speaking. The question was whether you were quiet enough to hear it." Chua looked at the fire. He said, and it was the most important sentence he had spoken in years, "I was not." The chief nodded once. He said, "Knowledge tells you what has already been learned. Wisdom knows what is still happening. You had filled yourself so completely with what you already knew that there was no room left for what the world was trying to teach you. The fox found that room and filled it with something useful to the fox. The mud taught the rest." The fire settled. Someone added a piece of wood. The warmth moved outward. Chua sat with the lesson the way a person sits with something heavy that they have finally stopped trying to put down, just holding it, feeling the full weight of it honestly for the first time. In the days that followed, the village noticed changes in him that were small but real. He asked questions now before offering conclusions. He walked more slowly through the forest and stopped more often. He sat with the old hunters in the mornings and did not speak during the prayers. He still had his maps. He still made his calculations. But he had learned to hold them lightly now, the way you hold a useful tool rather than a piece of identity, ready to set it down when something more important than theory asks to be heard. Grandpa Nasuba leans back from the fire and looks at you with that particular expression of his, the one that is half smile and half something much older than a smile. He says, "You know what the internet has given us? More information than any human being in history has ever had access to. And you know what it has also given us? More people stuck chin deep in mud than any generation that came before." He picks up a stick and stirs the coals slowly. He says, "The bear is not impressed by your search results. The forest does not care about your follower count. The mud will take you just as deep whether you have a verified account or not." He smiles. He says, "But there is always a way out. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it." Moral of the story: true intelligence is not measured by how much a person knows, but by how willing they are to keep learning. The world speaks constantly, through nature, through experience, through the quiet voices of those who have lived longer and seen more. But it can only be heard by someone who has made room for listening. A mind filled entirely with its own conclusions has no space left for truth. If this story reached something in you today, consider leaving a comment about a time when silence taught you more than any amount of information could. And subscribe so you never miss a story from the fire.
Folk Tales Sketchbook.